The night Marcus died, his mother held my hand in a hospital corridor for a long time without saying anything, and then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm and said, "He asked me to give you this." I looked at it. Small, square, folded twice. My name on the outside in his handwriting. I couldn't open it. Not there. Not in a hallway that still smelled like disinfectant, and the particular quiet of a floor where people were working very hard to keep death from winning. And where it had won anyway, an hour ago, in room 14, while I was sitting in the chair beside his bed, holding his hand the same way his mother was now holding mine. I put it in my jacket pocket. I told myself I'd open it when I could breathe. I didn't open it for 3 days. My name is Eli Vance. I'm 32. I'm an urban planner. I work on the kind of projects that take years to become real, that exist as drawings and proposals and committee arguments long before they become the thing you can walk through. I'm good at the long version of things. I'm good at understanding that what something will be matters more than what it is right now, and that patience is not the same as passivity. Marcus used to say I was the only person he knew who could love a blueprint more than the building, and he was right about that. And he was right about most things, which is why I trusted him completely, and why the letter in my pocket for 3 days was the most frightening piece of paper I had ever held. Marcus Reyes was my best friend for 11 years. He was 33 when he died. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 7 months before, moved faster than anyone told us it would. He was the kind of person who made a room function better just by being in it, not loudly, not by taking it over, but by asking the right question at the right moment, by listening the way that made you feel like what you were saying was worth hearing. He had been my closest friend since graduate school, through 3 cities and 2 career changes, and 1 divorce that wasn't mine, and 1 that was. And the shape of my adult life had been built around the fact of him in it, the way a city gets built around a river, not because anyone planned it that way, but because the river was there first and everything else followed. His sister was Nadia. She was 29. She taught secondary school math 2 towns over, which suited her in ways I'd understood for years before I could have explained why. The precision of it. The way a proof either held or it didn't. The satisfaction of watching a student find the logic for themselves. She had her mother's eyes and her brother's stillness, and a laugh she shared sparingly, only with people who had earned it, which I had spent years half aware of working toward without examining the working. She wore her hair natural, close cut on the sides, and she had a habit when she was thinking of pressing her thumbnail against her lower lip. Not biting, just pressure, just the small anchor of sensation while the rest of her went somewhere quiet. I had cataloged this without meaning to. I had cataloged most things about Nadia without meaning to, which is how you know something has gotten past the part of your brain that makes reasonable decisions. Marcus knew. Of course Marcus knew. He was the person who knew everything I was in the process of not admitting. Usually before I did, because 11 years of best friendship gives a person an accurate map of all the places you go when you think no one is watching. He had said her name to me, once, in the particular tone he used for things he meant seriously, not teasing, not cheerful, just steady, and I had changed the subject, and he had let me change it, and neither of us had returned to it, because I was living in the blueprint of something I wasn't ready to build, and he understood blueprints. He had understood me. The letter waited in my jacket pocket while I did the things you do in the days after someone dies. I made phone calls. I helped with logistics. I sat in Margaret Reyes's kitchen while she moved between the counter and the table in the particular purposeful way of women who are keeping themselves upright by keeping themselves useful. And I drank coffee I didn't taste and answered questions about Marcus's graduate school years and the time we drove to the coast at midnight because the city had been too loud. I was in that kitchen every day for 3 days, and Nadia was there every day too, home from her school on compassionate leave. And we were careful with each other the way you are, when grief has stripped all the regular surfaces away, and the only things left are the ones that were always there underneath. On the 3rd evening, I was alone in the kitchen when I heard her on the back porch. Through the glass door, I could see her sitting on the top step, with her knees up and her thumbnail at her lip, and her eyes on the dark yard. And the set of her shoulders was the specific shape of someone who has been strong in front of other people all day, and has found, finally, a few minutes to be the other thing. I didn't go out. That was her minute, not mine to enter. I made 2 cups of tea, and I set one near the door where she'd see it when she came back in, and I went home. I opened the letter that night. Marcus had written it 6 weeks before he died, which I knew from the date at the top, which was written in the same unhurried hand as always, the same hand that had addressed the outside with my name. It wasn't long. He wasn't a man who used more words than he needed, and the letter was very much itself, clear and warm and without any of the performance that grief sometimes asks for from the dying. He told me he wasn't afraid. He told me he was sorry for the speed of it, because he knew I was someone who did better with time, and he wished he'd had more to give me. He said the things you say to an 11-year friend, the things that land in the chest and stay there. And then, near the end, in the same steady hand as everything else, he said this: "You have been in love with my sister for a very long time. I have watched you choose the blueprint over the building again and again, for reasons I understand and reasons I think you've outgrown. I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I'm asking you to stop deciding the future for both of you. She's allowed to know. She's allowed to choose. Let her. She knows I'm writing this. She doesn't know what it says. That part is yours." I sat with that for a long time. The apartment was very quiet. The letter was in my hands, and I read it twice, and then I set it on the table, and I looked at it and understood that Marcus Reyes, who had never once said "I told you so" in 11 years of being right about things, had found a way to say it from a place I couldn't argue with. That sentence did something quiet to the room. I didn't do anything about it that night. I wasn't going to. The timing was wrong, and I knew it. Grief is not a context for new things, and I would not have made it one. But I stopped. That night, deciding the future for both of us. I let myself know what I knew. That was small, but it was the first honest step I'd taken in a very long time, and small honest steps are how you eventually get somewhere. The weeks after a funeral have their own rhythm. People come and go. Casseroles arrive and get eaten or don't. The house slowly returns to its ordinary temperature. Margaret went back to her routines. Nadia went back to her school. I went back to my office and my blueprints and the long version of things. And I found that I was thinking about the letter and about Marcus's particular patience with me, and about a back porch and 2 cups of tea and the shape of someone's shoulders at the end of a day they'd earned the right to be tired. I called Nadia 3 weeks after the funeral. Not about anything. I said I was checking in, which was true and was also not the whole truth, and she said she was all right, which was true and was also not the whole truth, and we talked for an hour about Marcus, which was both true and the whole truth. Because there was no version of either of us in that stretch of time that wasn't mostly grief. She laughed once during the call, something I'd said about graduate school, about a trip Marcus had documented in a series of increasingly absurd photographs, and it was real and low. The laugh she gave sparingly to people who had earned it, and I sat in my car in the parking garage where I'd stopped to take the call, and felt something in me loosen a small, necessary degree. We talked every week after that. Not arranged, it just happened. The way things settle into pattern when two people are circling the same loss from different angles, and find that circling together is easier than circling alone. She told me things about Marcus I hadn't known, the private version of him she'd grown up alongside, and I told her things about the one I'd been friends with. And somewhere in the overlap between those two portraits was the fullest picture of him either of us would ever have. Once, in the second month, she told me about the summer Marcus had taught her to drive in an empty parking lot, how he'd had more patience for her than anyone else ever had, how she'd cried when she'd finally passed the test, and he'd acted like that was completely normal, and made her a celebratory dinner out of whatever was in the fridge, which turned out to be eggs and leftover rice and something neither of them could identify with confidence. I laughed, and she laughed, and afterward there was a quiet on the phone that was different from the quiet of grief, lighter, the kind that means two people are in the same place. I noticed it. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed it, and I filed it somewhere I was trying to stop adding things to. It was the most honest I'd been with another person in a long time. Grief does that. It burns off the decorative surfaces, and what's left is either nothing or something real. 4 months after the funeral, she drove to the city for a curriculum conference and texted to say she'd be passing through, and we had dinner. Not planned as more than dinner. A table at the place near my office, an hour and a half on a Wednesday evening, and we talked about Marcus and about her students, and about a planning project I was working on that was finally, after 2 years, beginning to look like what it had always meant to be. She asked good questions, the kind that meant she'd been listening to the previous ones, and at some point the hour and a half became 3 hours, and the restaurant was quieter than it had been when we'd arrived, and neither of us had noticed the middle go. At the door, outside, she said she was glad we'd done this. I said I was too. She looked at me for a moment in the way I'd seen her look at things she was genuinely considering, the thumbnail at her lip, quick, and then gone. And then she said, "He told me he was writing you a letter. He wouldn't tell me what was in it." I didn't say anything. "You don't have to tell me either," she said. "I'm not asking." A pause. I think about it sometimes, what he would have said. To you. That he couldn't say to me about me. Something in my chest went very still. I looked at her in the streetlight outside the restaurant, and I thought about a blueprint that had been sitting on a table for 6 years, drawn with precision, never built. I thought about a man who had known me well enough to wait until he couldn't wait anymore, and then had handed me the only instruction I needed in 2 sentences. I thought about the future I'd been deciding for both of us without consulting her, and about being asked, plainly, to stop. "He told me," I said, carefully, "to stop choosing the blueprint over the building." I held her gaze. He was talking about something specific. "If you want to know what, I'll tell you. But I need you to know that whatever you do with it is yours. I'm not telling you because I expect something back. I'm telling you because he asked me to let you know, and because he was almost always right, and because I've spent 6 years deciding the future for both of us, and I think it's past time I stopped." She was very still. The thumbnail came up to her lip, held there, and her eyes were steady on mine with the expression that meant she was doing the math. The real math, the kind she did when the answer mattered. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. Not everything. The letter was mine, and some of it would stay that way. But I told her what I'd been carrying, carefully, in the way you carry something that belongs to someone else, that I'd been in love with her for a long time, that I'd chosen not to know it rather than know it and do nothing, that the letter had asked me to let her decide for herself, and that I was standing on a sidewalk in November doing exactly that. I told her that I expected nothing from her tonight, or any night. That the friendship was real and complete on its own, and I had no interest in damaging it, and that I understood if she needed time or distance, or neither, and just wanted to go home. I meant all of it. That's the thing about finally saying the true thing. When you've waited long enough, it comes out clean. She listened without interrupting, which was its own thing, because Nadia was not a passive listener by nature. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the street, and then she turned back to me and said, "I've been trying to figure out for 4 months whether the reason I call you every week is about Marcus or about you." She stopped there. Let that sit. "I think it started as Marcus," she said. "I think somewhere in the middle it became about you. And I don't know yet what to do with that, except that I'd like to find out, if you're willing to find out slowly." I said slowly was the only speed I knew. She laughed, the real one, the earned one, and it went into the cold November air, and I watched it go, and thought about a man who had known this was coming and had made sure, from wherever he'd gone, that neither of us missed it. I reached out, and she took my hand. Not grabbed, not urgent, just her hand in mine on a sidewalk outside a restaurant. 2 people choosing the same direction at the same pace. We walked to where her car was parked, which took longer than it needed to because neither of us was in a hurry, and we talked about small things, the way you talk when the big thing has been said and you're both still standing. At her car, she looked at me in the particular way she'd looked at me in the restaurant doorway, considering, real, and she said, "He would have had opinions about this." 17 of them, I said. Minimum. Would they have been insufferable? Completely, I paused. He also would have been right. She smiled, quieter than the laugh, the kind that stays in the eyes. She got in the car. She texted me when she got home, which I hadn't asked her to and which she hadn't promised. And the text said only, slowly. I sat with that word for a long time in my apartment. It was the best architectural instruction I'd ever been given. We were slow. We were patient with each other and with the grief that was woven into everything. Because you can't remove grief from the weave without damaging the cloth, and neither of us wanted a version of this that pretended the cloth was made of anything else. We talked more. We saw each other more. There were evenings in her kitchen that started as dinner and became something that lasted until 2 in the morning, and there was the afternoon she came to see a project I'd been working on break ground at last, and she stood beside me on the site and watched it begin to be what it had always meant to be. And she didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "So this is what you love about blueprints?" I said yes. She said she thought she understood it better now. I understood, by then, what Marcus had always meant. Not that the blueprint was wrong, that the building was worth beginning. A year after dinner, she brought me to the house she'd grown up in for a Sunday that turned into the kind of afternoon where nobody leaves, because the leaving would break something good. Margaret cooked. Nadia sat beside me on the back porch step, the same step I'd watched her sit on alone the night of the funeral, the same dark yard, a warmer evening, and her hand was in mine and her shoulder was against mine, and the house behind us was full of the sound of her mother in the kitchen, and a life continuing in the way that lives do, imperfectly and onward. She said, "He would have been unbearable today." "The most," I said. "He would have found a way to take credit." "He did take credit," I said. 6 weeks before he died. In writing, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm glad he did." "So am I," I said. "He was almost always right." She leaned her head against my shoulder, small, chosen, easy, and we sat on the back step of the house she'd grown up in, while the evening came in slow and gold over the yard. And I thought about a folded piece of paper in a hospital corridor, and a man who had known me well enough to give me the one instruction I needed, and trusted me enough to let me find my own way to it. Years later, when people asked how we got together, she said it started with a letter she'd never read, written by the person who knew them both best. I said it started with a blueprint I'd been too afraid to build, and a man who had seen it clearly long before I had and waited, with his characteristic patience, for me to catch up. We were both telling the same story. The truth was that Marcus Reyes, in 11 years of being right about things, had been rightest about this. That she was allowed to know, and she was allowed to choose, and the only thing standing between the blueprint and the building had always been me. Nothing important had appeared overnight. It had simply stopped hiding. What would you have done if someone handed you a letter, written by the person you'd just lost, that said the thing you'd been afraid to say yourself, and asked you to finally say it? And have you ever loved someone quietly for so long that the love became part of the architecture of your life, the thing everything else was built around, and you only understood that when someone who saw it clearly made sure you couldn't look away? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.